JPP लाइव की आज की नशिस्त में खुशामदीद। मेरा नाम एजाज हैदर है। JPP लाइव में हम पुलिस इस्लाहात, मुजरमाना इंसाफ के निज़ाम, पुलिस तशद्दुद, इंसानी हकूक़ और मुतल्लिका मामलात पर गुफ्तगू करते हैं। आज की नशिस्त में हम जेलों की इस्लाह और कैदियों के हकूक़ के बारे में बात करेंगे। 1975 से 10 अगस्त कैदियों के लिए इंसाफ के दिन के तौर पर मनाया जाता है। JPP ने जेल की इस्लाहात के मुतालिक एक तहकीकी रिपोर्ट भी कमीशन की है, जिसे राधा शाह ने लिखा है। आज की इस नशिस्त में हमारे साथ हैं राधा JPP में एक मुहक्किक के तौर पर काम करती हैं। हमारे साथ जलीला हैदर भी शामिल होंगी। वकील हैं, बलोचिस्तान से ताल्लुक़ है और इंसानी हकूक़ पर अपने काम के हवाले से उनकी पहचान है। हमारे साथ सुलेमान ज़ेब मौजूद हैं, जो कि इस्लामाबाद हाई कोर्ट में वकालत करते हैं और एक कानूनी मदद का इदारा भी चलाते हैं। और कुछ ही देर में हमारे साथ फाखरा ताबिंदा भी शामिल होंगी, जो कि श्रीलंका की एक जेल में मुकीद रही। But before I get to the panel and our discussion, let me quickly say for our non-Urdu speaking viewers that on JPP Live, we discuss a number of issues that broadly deal with the criminal justice system, its various components or rungs, if you will. And this is our 9th episode. Today we are discussing jail reforms within the context of Prisoners' Justice Day that began in 1975, commemorating the suicide of an inmate in an Ontario prison a year earlier. The discussion will focus on the rights of prisoners. Yes, they too have rights within the broader ambit of prison reform. So let me welcome my panelists here. Right now, I have with me Radha Shah and Suleiman Zeeb, but as I said, we'll also be joined by Jalila Haider and Fakhra. Let me begin with Radha here, since she has written the report that was commissioned by JPP. Give us a sense, Radha, of why this report is important. I did see your, in fact, let me pull it up. I did see your op-ed in Dawn, which was published on 10th August, titled Unjust Jail Reform. And it's a very interesting op-ed. It also gives us a sense of how, this issue, of course, I mean, this issue gets exacerbated in our parts of the world, but even in the developed countries, this is an issue that's alive, even today, in many ways. So give us a sense of why it's important for JPP to have commissioned this report and for you to have researched it and written.
It's important because people who are in jail are citizens of the country that they are from. And that means that they are not only subject to the laws, but of that country, that they should also be able to have equal access to those laws. And jail should therefore not be a place where those are taken away from them, especially because a lot of the justification for the continuity of prisons is the idea that inmates deserve reform and access to rehabilitation in order to become members of society once again.
Right. One of the reasons that in some countries prisons are referred to as correctional facilities. But let me just problematize it a bit. Foucault wrote that famous book, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of Prisons, and he talks about the fact that, the book starts with a very gory scene on a street of Paris where someone is being punished for attempting regicide. In other words, to kill the king. And he called it the culture of spectacle. And then he sort of draws on that Banthamite concept of the panopticon, the building which incidentally was designed by Bantham's elder brother, who was an engineer. And then he talks about the movement from that culture of spectacle to the carceral culture. And he talks about the power over the body and how, and he also mentions in that context military barracks and schools and various other instruments in and through which governments and states acquire that dominance over people through people's bodies. Now, if we look at it from that context, how much or what kind of rights we're talking about, especially if these facilities, whether you call them prisons or you call them, correctional facilities, are actually meant to subdue the instincts of the individuals, the inmates, and to get them in line with whatever the social and moral and legal mores of the society are.
Yes, I would agree with you that correctional facilities is a term among others that is put on prisons to make them sound like they are better places than they actually are, and that they serve a function of rehabilitation, as if the people who are there are supposed to be there, having failed to function appropriately in society.
Right. Okay. Let me go to Suleiman Zaid before I get back to you in order for you to give us some salient features of the report that or your findings. Suleiman, you run this legal aid cell also. You are by training a lawyer. Uh, Give us a sense of what the landscape is, not just in terms of the system itself, but also in terms of the kind of ambiance, for want of a better word. So XYZ suddenly finds himself or herself within this ringer. How does that person's life change when from the normality, quote unquote, the normality of life, to being in the jaws, so to speak, of the criminal justice system?
Well, obviously, you do have it is a major life change. So you start off with the real issue comes, I guess, when you're first about to be arrested, or whether you are arrested, whether you've gotten your bail, whether you haven't tried to get bail yet. The initial issue with everything starts off with your arrest. After getting your arrest and you put in your uh, in police remand, you're produced before a court, you're taken back into police remand for, let's say, a week, 2 weeks, sometimes just a few days. um, and there's a constant your initial the initial shock comes from, maybe from what I could understand to be, the constant back and forth from the police station to the court. And then after that, when if you're still not able to get bail during that process, and then you end up being taken into judicial remand, you're not going to be placed before a court then for a while, but you're taken back to whatever prison you would be in. So, for example, if it was in Islamabad, you would likely be sent to Adiala jail at that point in judicial remand. In that situation, um, you're put in the prison lockup, or the prison with all these other prisoners. Um, and it is obviously a real shock to a person, um, to have that over their head. But it's also a shock for that person who may actually get bail, who may be out of the prison, um, or may have gotten bail from the very beginning, because then their life is just, until a verdict is passed, it's just you going between the court and then you're home, um, making sure that you're there at 8:30 in the morning, figuring out that the judge will listen to your case after 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock. um, and you're really in a bit of a particular loop, where it's, for a while, your life just becomes about your next hearing. um, and whether anything's going to happen in that next hearing. Cases can go on for years, in which case you're in the courts after every 2 weeks or maybe a month. Um, Cases can also go on for a lot shorter, depending on the evidence and all. So there is a real shock in being pushed back and forth between this system constantly. And I'll even say this, and 9 times out of 10, not really understanding the system itself, not understanding what lawyer is telling you, not understanding what the judge is thinking. Um, I'll say this: there's so many times when I would have a client who would say something like, I think this judge really doesn't like me, or he really hates me, or she really doesn't listen to you or listen to me. And you're sitting back and you're trying to explain to them that the judge might just be doing exactly what their job requires. They're not being unfair. They might just be um, they might just be looking at things with a certain type of scrutiny. Again, on the other hand, there are times when you find judges who just are not being very fair uh, to the accused as well. And then there'll be times when you go there and you realize you've just appeared before the judge, nothing has happened, and there's been an adjournment. And again, the client is thinking at that point, is my lawyer even doing anything? And we can't blame them either. It's a system which they don't understand. It's a system which we only understand after going through a number of the cases. So there's
Right.
proper to the system. There's a proper shock to the person when they're brought into that system.
Right. It almost sounds as sort of diabolical as Kafka's Joseph K. in the trial. But I'll return to you to try and find out what exactly are the multiple black holes in the system. But let me go back to Radha Shah on the sort of basic findings of the report that JPP had commissioned. Radha.
Sure. First, to return to your earlier description of Foucault and elaborate on that a little bit. His work really informed the theoretical framework of how I looked at prisons in Pakistan. One kind of historical transition is the move, especially under the colonial administration here, to not only humanize prisons, but to make them more efficient, so to speak. And this was because they found the kind of brutality when it came to punishment that Foucault described to be an embarrassment. So the transition that takes place is one where the prison administration comes up with ways to continue its punitive objectives, but now this may not necessarily take place on the body, though it certainly continued to do so across prison history and across colonial history in general. But it also becomes a form of punishment that is enacted on the conscience. So that's when you see the introduction of forms of punishment where the idea is for the prisoner to be alone in prison for long periods of time, and to be completely bored. And that boredom is supposed to be a punishment for having, according to the rules of governance, having violated the privilege of being in free society. So to move now to your next question, my wider area of research is an examination of how post-colonial societies are built atop their previous forms of rule, as well as the forms of resistance that they go through, despite which a lot of forms of colonial thought continue to inform the running of their institutions, so prisons in Pakistan, and the way people think. And what I mean by the way people think is why people believe certain people belong in free society and why people believe other people ought to be criminalized and sent to prison. So what the report does is look at narrative accounts of prisoner experiences with forms of criminalization and how a law enforcement system tied to an incarceration system penalizes their identity. So by identity, I mean their religious identity or their ethnic identity, their descent, that is, people who object to the ways in which they are treated on vocal platforms, as well as class itself and poverty itself. A lot of people are in prison simply because they cannot afford bail and they are there under pretrial conditions. And then we also have the criminalization of gender. So now all of this takes place across a general platform that we are, most of us are aware of. So as I described, forms of socioeconomic disenfranchisement, and then the under-resourcing of prisons such that they are not, as we described, actually correctional facilities. And then we have an overburdened judiciary. And then that goes back to the previous comments that were discussed. So I'll stop there.
Right. I have another question, but let me just quickly go back to Suleiman on one point that you've identified, and I think that's a very important point. Also kind of dovetails with what Suleiman was saying about this being a cycle which can go on for a very long time. And of course, you suddenly find yourself, as I said earlier, in the jaws of that criminal justice system. Suleiman, in your experience, once someone gets into that, in terms of the socio-economic strata, is it easier for those with money to get out of it or extricate themselves from this, and more difficult for those who don't have the money and who just seem to get lost in this black hole?
So the short answer to that is yes. But I will also say that it's a bit more complicated than just if someone has the money or doesn't have the money. Right now, for example, when we talk about prisoners or we talk about criminal law, we tend to not, and they're not, and at the same time, they're not the primary discussion point of this discussion as well. We're not talking about situations such as white collar crimes, where often enough the people who are accused may not be from the more socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. The thing is that in certain cases, I would say that yes, definitely having coming from a richer background does help you. It can help you in multiple ways without naming exact issues.
And if
Without,
quick two-finger intervention, and that
yes,
help can start right from the way the police is going to
yeah,
take up the case, how the prosecution is going to make up the case, and so on and so forth.
yeah. It starts off from there. So for example, it's not uncommon in narcotics cases, for example, for police to very conveniently mess up the evidentiary requirements to show a certain level of narcotics being found on a person. At the same time, it's not uncommon for where there are cases between two particular parties, where the more disadvantaged party, if that is the victim's family, will take a case back after some influence. And it's also not uncommon. And another thing with getting out of this whole point of, even if I'm accusing certain segments of society, getting out of that is that just the fact that you're able to afford legal help for people who can't afford that legal help. they tend to end up relying on someone who might be part of the public prosecution team. And in that situation, that person is not taking the case seriously, and so it doesn't help out. But at the same time, whether you're well off or whether you're not, if the state and the society wants to make an example out of you, it can, and your wealth would not necessarily save you too much there. It can help, but it won't
Uh,
necessarily save you completely.
but we're talking about averages, and
Yeah,
on that basis,
yeah. Of course,
if
on the
you
large
know,
scale, I agree. On the large scale, I agree
abs-
completely.
absolutely.
Sorry, and
Let me
just
go
one
back.
point.
Yeah. Okay.
Just one
Yeah.
point with
Sure.
what Radha said about even the idea of boredom being part of the punishment. This is definitely, I don't know if it's part of the punishment, but I do know of one former prisoner who told me very clearly, and I think he wrote about it as well one time, where he said that you'd be surprised at how prison cells can actually be very clean at times. And he said the reason for that is because we don't have much else to do, and so we end up spending a lot of time just sitting up and cleaning up after ourselves to the point that there's nothing else that we can end up doing. So the idea of boredom being a part of the punishment is something which I very much believe could be a part of the system as well. If not on purpose, it definitely has become part of it.
Yeah, that boredom certainly is. It's definitely not creative ennui. But I have a bigger problem with the way prison. There are lots of films also, and lots of documentaries on this also. And this is where I go back to Radha Shah. Uh, so life outside, modern life outside the prison, uh, has kind of configured itself in a way that uh, our primal instincts are kept under check. But once you are in a prison, it's almost like the Golding's experiment with school children in Lord of the Flies, where they get marooned on an island, and within a few days you can see that there are some boys who come up as dominant and domineering, and there are others uh, who are kind of subordinate. Something akin to that also happens in prisons, especially in prisons where you have, uh, you know, hardcore criminals with their own gangs inside, and then their ability to dominate other prisoners, their ability to have connections with the jail or prison staff and get facilities there, and so on and so forth. So it becomes another form of primeval sort of experience for the first timers, or those who are not as hard knuckled as others, in a manner of speaking. So that is something, despite all the reforms and everything, that's something that somehow happens, just like it did with the schoolboys who were marooned on an island. Is that something that should concern us? Is that something that can be addressed? It's not entirely eradicated, but at least sort of, ameliorated.
It certainly should concern us for a couple of reasons. Number one, within the prison rules themselves, hierarchies are specified. This is what is called prisoner classification. So based on one's education, based on one's wealth, and the assumption that that means that that person, due to those privileges, would not necessarily have committed a crime that warrants them to experience working class forms of punishment. It's based on these sorts of judgments, and these also come from the colonial era, and the idea that more privileged prisoners deserve more privileges in prison, so a softer experience in prison. Now, if this is written into the prison rules themselves, and if this is part of how, and if the modification of these documents in order to facilitate prison reform on paper doesn't remove these classifications, what you have are a set of regulations that facilitate maltreatment in practice. So this comes to the second part of your question and your description of what happens in prison. Definitely. In my conversations with ex-prisoners, many of them described either being victim to this system or being privileged within the system. And they also described the ways in which prison wardens, the jail administration, is also involved in this whole setup. Much of it has to do with an economy, what I term an economy of extortion. So say, for example, you want to be able to make a phone call, or you want a particular item, let's say a snack. In order for you to get that, it's not a straightforward process of there's a designated time for calls, or there is a canteen from which I can purchase these items. You have to go through someone.
Yes.
Meaning that person is extracting a bribe from you, essentially, and then the price of things goes up. And this system, as many prisoners described it, is so violent. It's not as though a prisoner without power can say, well, actually, I'm going to choose to forego this particular item because I don't have the money, or I don't believe in participating in the system of bribery. If they choose not to do so, then they face violence for that. They can be beaten for choosing to take some kind of a moral high ground. Yeah, so these are the sorts of things that prisoners describe to me that maps very much onto the description you provided.
Absolutely. It becomes very primeval. But we also have someone with us now, joined us, as I said earlier in my opening, Fakhra Tabinder. She was in jail in Sri Lanka. Fakhra, आपको मेरी आवाज आ रही है? फाखरा, आपको मेरी आवाज आ रही है? फाखरा, आपको मेरी आवाज आ रही है? Okay, so Fakhra is going to, okay, her mic was off. Let's see. Yeah, Fakhra, आपको मेरी आवाज आ रही है?
हाँ जी, आ रही है। नहीं, थोड़ा सा हम चले। इजाज़त, आपको फाखरा की आवाज आ रही है? आ रही है।
जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम। अच्छा जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया प्रोग्राम में शिरकत का। तो ये बताइए, हमें इससे गरज नहीं है कि आपके ऊपर क्या चार्ज था श्रीलंका में, लेकिन हम ये जानना चाह रहे हैं कि वहाँ पे आप कितना अरसा जेल में रहीं, और वहाँ पे जेल के का जो तजुर्बा था, ये किस किस्म का था? मतलब क्या बहुत ही बुरा था? मैंने ये सुना है कि आपके बच्चे भी आपके साथ थे। कुछ थोड़ा सा हमें बताएंगी कि ये क्या सूरत हाल थी?
मैं वहाँ पे 10 साल रही हूँ, और बच्चे भी मेरे पास थे, और कह लें कि बहुत ज़्यादा जिंदगी मुश्किल इतनी हो गई थी, बस मौत ही मांगती थी रोजाना।
आपकी आवाज नहीं आ रही मुझे। आपको मेरी आवाज आ रही है?
आ रही आवाज आ रही है। बहुत ज्यादा मुश्किलें थी वहाँ पे श्रीलंका में। गलती हो गई, वहाँ पे चले गए और कह लें कि जहन्नम में गिर गए थे। बच्चों के साथ वो भी बस अल्लाह का करम हो गया कि अल्लाह ने
Okay, I
Yes.
can't hear Fakhra. Uh,
Yeah, I could hear her.
for some bizarre reason, I couldn't hear her.
Shall I tell you what she said?
Yeah, sure, sure. Oh, strange that you could also hear her.
Yeah.
Some reason I couldn't.
Okay, so she said she was in jail in Sri Lanka for 10 years with
Yeah,
her children.
that much I got, and after
Yeah.
that I lost it. Yeah.
And the next thing that she said is that she couldn't really stand the thought of continued life like this.
Okay. And did she say anything about when she was repatriated, whether her children are with her?
No,
No.
you'll need to
Okay.
ask her more now.
Yeah. Okay.
जब
Let's
आप
see. Yeah.
नहीं और
फाखरा, आपको मेरी आवाज आ रही है?
वहाँ पे हालात कैसे थे उसके बारे में कुछ बात करेंगे आप?
More
नहीं
aptly
बच्चे
whether
को
I can
साथ
hear her.
नहीं लेके आई, बच्चों को साथ
जी,
नहीं
तो
लेके आई।
आप पाकिस्तान वापस कब आई?
2020 में।
अच्छा, तो वहाँ पे
2000
जेल के हालात कैसे कैसे थे? मतलब वहाँ पे जेल की सख्तियाँ होती हैं, किस तरह का, मतलब जाहिर है ये सवाल मुझे कुछ बेवकूफ़ाना लग रहा है जो मैं पूछ रहा हूँ कि जेल का तजुर्बा कैसा था। जाहिर है जेल का तजुर्बा कभी भी अच्छा नहीं होता, लेकिन हम वैसे जानना चाह रहे हैं क्योंकि हम पाकिस्तान की जेलों के हवाले से बात कर रहे थे, तो मैं ये जानना चाह रहा था कि श्रीलंका में सूरत हाल क्या है।
श्रीलंका में जो जेल का जो एक्सपीरियंस था ना, वो कह लें कि सारी जिंदगी ऐसी जगह देखी नहीं है जैसी वो है। पाकिस्तान का और उधर का बहुत ज्यादा फर्क है। वहां पे कह लें कि इंसान जब उनके हाथ में आता है ना, तो वो जानवर की तरह इस्तेमाल करते हैं अपने कामों के लिए, और वो डेली प्रेशराइज करते हैं कि भाई तुमने ये किया, तुमने ये किया, तुमने ये किया, ये सुबह शाम यही काम होता है उनका, जिससे बंदा वैसे तो चलो मरना ही होता है, जब आना है, जब मौत आनी है तो आनी है, लेकिन वो लोग इंसान को वक्त से पहले ही जो है ना गिरा देते हैं और मार देते हैं। बहुत ज्यादा वहां पे जो है ना मुसीबत है। और वहां पे कह लें कि औरतों को भी वो जानवरों की तरह इस्तेमाल करते हैं काम के
Okay,
लिए।
I need to get a summary from either Suleiman or Radha, so what she said, because I could only hear like a couple of words like Janwar, but rest of the time the voice just dropped. Can someone
चलिए
give me the
इनसे
summary?
बात कर लेते हैं।
नहीं उनको उर्दू समझ आ रही है पर शायद आपके एजाज आपको मेरी आवाज क्लियर आ रही है?
I still can't hear her.
Okay. She was explaining. I think they're just gonna put her back up. Basically, she was stating a lot of the same things, that it was an extremely unpleasant experience. Towards the end, she was saying that they treated women badly as well in the jail. They would treat them like animals and make them do a lot of labor as well. And I think she's back on now, so maybe we could get a better sense of everything right now.
जी फाखरा,
हाँ
आप कुछ
जी
और कहना चाहेंगी?
सर, यही कहना चाहती हूँ कि जिंदगी बहुत मुश्किल है, चाहे अंदर है और अभी तो बहुत ही मुश्किल है। चले इंसान किसी भी वजह से कोई गुनाह कर लेता है, लेकिन फिर बाहर का जमाना जो है ना वो खड़े नहीं होने देता, जीने नहीं देता। बहुत
Let
मुश्किल
me
है।
take this to Radha Shah. That's a very important point. Okay, it's just one slip for whatever reason, and you serve time, and theoretically speaking, you have or you should have atoned for that slip up, but it becomes such a red entry in your life's dossier that it keeps haunting you for the rest of your life, in terms of making relationships, in terms of finding jobs, in terms of, sort of subsuming yourself back into the social fabric, it just doesn't go away. Is that something that should bother us as a society?
Ex-prisoners I spoke to were very clear that prison is not a rehabilitative space, that it is a violent space, that it is a punitive space, and that one of the results of going to prison is that it hardens criminals. And that creates a cycle of repeat crime. And here, these are prisoners who they're talking about disenfranchised prisoners who they interacted with. So examples like young drug addicts. The experience of prison and not actually getting rehabilitative forms of help mean that it's a circle. You're going in and out of prison for the same reasons. For prisoners who were there due to political dissent, they described feeling even more wedded to their cause, because prison for them was yet another representative example of them being silenced and their views not being heard.
So basically, the system against which they are dissenting is the system that is making their dissent punitive, and the punishment itself is making them even more, providing them greater strength towards why they should continue with their dissent, because they want to clean up the system or whatever. We shan't get into the fact that every system, every ideology, which begins even as a disruption, ultimately creates its own orthodoxy, its own system. But Suleiman, this thing about this becoming a stigma, is there any way that any society can address this? I mean, I'm asking, I know it's not an easy question to answer. I also understand that it's kind of outside the ambit of our discussion in terms of jail reforms and all that, because it essentially seeks to address a bigger question in terms of the social acceptance of someone who slipped up and has had a jail sentence. Is there any way that would it require educating people, and then to further problematize it, and going back to what Radha said about someone then getting into a cycle, meaning he or she gets out and then goes back in for some reason, maybe because he couldn't get a job, turned back to someone, some contact from within the prison, did something unlawful again, got caught again, goes back, and so it becomes a cycle and never gets out.
When it comes to a situation where a prisoner has served their sentence and is put back into society, allowed back into society, I think we have to address the fact that maybe the biggest issue is understanding that this is not just a small segment of people who are facing a particular issue. The prison numbers are quite high in general. There are quite a few people who may have spent some time in prison, and I think there tends to be an argument that we always have: is prison supposed to be rehabilitative? Is it supposed to be punitive? When you fall on different sides of the spectrum, you might fall right in the middle and say there has to be a bit of both. We say they have to have education. We need to teach them skills, so when they're out of prison, that they can get those skills. But the problem is they can use those skills or use that education. But the problem is when they're out of jail, then no one wants to accept, no one wants to employ them. There has to be a bit of an attempt, in my opinion, to assist prisoners once they're out of jail or once they've served their sentence, especially in Pakistan, in assisting them with becoming functional members of society without having to go back into whatever, if we're assuming that the prisoner was guilty in the first place. I do defense, so most of the time I will never admit that a client is guilty, even if they serve a sentence. But even if whether they are or aren't guilty, when they come out, they need to be I think they need to be properly accommodated to become functioning members of society. And I think that is maybe an area which we truly are lacking in. And I do know of an ex-prisoner who very much believes in this cause, of making ex-prisoners or former prisoners functioning members of society once they're obviously out, or to try to assist them in setting up whatever sort of trade they want to start based on whatever sort of skills they might have learned, whether in prison or outside of prison. And I think there has to be, that is then where our state has to start accommodating the prisoners as well. And to be fair, we can also pitch this to the state by saying that if you make sure that this former prisoner who the state might declare to be a horrible man or a horrible woman, based off of either a mistake that they have made or based off or just because they were declared such in a trial. If you want to stop them from doing those horrible things again, once they're out of jail, you have to give them something else to do. You have to give them employment opportunities. You have to give them education opportunities. You have to give them the opportunity to actually live properly in society.
Right.
So I think that's a major issue that has to be
Okay.
that has to be addressed.
Okay. So we've almost run out of time, but one final, and of course the fact that this is a topic on which one can go on and peeling different layers of the onion. But one final question from Radha Shah. Accepting the fact that we're going to have prisons, and sort of slightly moving away from problematizing the concept as we have tried to do, and getting into certain basics. Given your experience, do you think that we could use certain expedients, like, for instance, expanding the prisons, getting rid of overcrowding, making sections where you have under trial prisoners separate, the first timers separate, and the more habitual prisoners separate? Do you think that is a system which could have some kind of salutary impact on some of the issues that we have discussed?
I think that for the human rights of prisoners who are in incarceration facilities, and particularly remembering that I think some 70% of them are pre-trial, so they haven't even received convictions. In order to fix things like overcrowding, in order to ensure that pre-trial prisoners are separated from convicted prisoners, yes, the facilities do need improvement, but that is fixing a problem that comes down the line. It's not fixing the cause of the problem. And the cause of the problem is how we view criminalization as a solution for deciding who belongs in society, who has access to equality in society, and who doesn't. And a lot of these societal notions determine who gets access to resources. A lot of this needs to change first, or it needs to change concurrently if we are going to see prisons become more humane spaces.
Right. Couldn't agree more with you, except the fact is that, I mean, as I said, that moving away from the philosophical and the conceptual, we went back into it, and I completely agree with you. But my question was essentially with reference to, what we could do practically in terms of ameliorating the situation. And of course, I mean, I completely, as I said, agree with the broader point of resources, criminalization, who should be inside and who should be outside. It was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Radha. We keenly await your report. Thank you, Suleiman, for your time. Fakhra Bibi, आपका भी बहुत शुक्रिया. Hopefully, we'll have another opportunity to speak about these issues. With this, Khuda Hafiz from my side, and we come to the end of our 9th episode of Live with JPP.
Thank you very much.
Thank